Okay, so we're going to do a basic domain and range review with graphs and relations. Okay, so let's look at this first graph. So remember, when I'm going to do domain, domain runs left and right because domain is the x values. Range runs down and up and down because that's the y values. That's the direction of the y-axis, direction of the x-axis is domain. So I'm going to take my little line that's helping me, and I'm going to come over until I get to the first point, the farthest x value that I have, and that's right there at -5. Okay, so that -5 is the first value, and I can see here that it is an open dot, so that means that it's going to be not included, and we show that in our domain as a parenthesis. Okay, so I'm going to continue on with my line until I get to the farthest right point, and that is going to be when x is 0. Please do not put 5. 5 is the value of the y, and we are talking about domain. So this is 0, and it is a closed dot, so that's going to be included with a bracket. Okay, so we're going to do our range from the bottom. The first value that I touch is a -5 open dot, so that's going to be not included. Up to, so we're going to go to our farthest, our highest point in the y, which is at a +5 closed dot, so we're going to show that with that bracket. Okay. Number 2, I'm going to start from the left-hand side, work my way over until I touch -2. That's the first x value, and it is an open dot, not included, so I'm going to show that with parentheses. Up to, I'm going to keep going across my graph until I get to the highest point, or the largest x value, which is a +2, also with an open circle, so that's going to be not included. Then I'm going to come up from the bottom, the smallest value being -3. Now it hits 2 dots, but both of those are open, and we're going to show that with a parenthesis. Then I'm going to come up until I get to the highest point, which is when y is 5. Now notice that this is a nice smooth curve, no open dots, no gaps, so we're going to show that with a nice included bracket. Okay. Number 3, I'm going to come over until I touch the graph for the first time, which is when x is -1 with a parenthesis because of open dot. Continue on until I get to the largest value, which is when x is 3, again with that open dot. So I'm going to have -1 to +3, both of those not included. Do the same coming from the range from the bottom. The first value I touch is a -4, not included, up to a +2, also not included. So I'm going to go from -4 to +2, both not included. Number 4, so for my domain, I'm going to start from the left. First value that I touch is a -4. Now it hits 2 points, but both of those points are not included, so I'm going to have a parenthesis till I get to the farthest right of my graph, which is a -2. Now notice, it's a nice smooth curve, no gaps, no holes, so I'm going to indicate that with a bracket. Okay, so my range, I'm coming up from the bottom. -4, it is an open hole, so that's going to be a parenthesis all the way to the highest point on the graph, which is a +4. Again, another parenthesis because those are not included, open dots not included. Number 5, I'm going to come from the left for my domain. The first value that I touch is a -5, not included, open dot. We're going to continue on. Now, a lot of students will stop here because it's the end point, but that is not as far right as my graph goes, so I'm going to continue past until I get to the farthest right-hand point, which is when x is 3. And again, notice nice smooth curve, no holes, no gaps. So it's going to be from -5, not included, open dot, to 3, included with a bracket. So I'm going to come from the bottom for range. The first y value I touch is -2 up to +4, both not included because of those open holes. Okay, so I have -2 up to +4 with parentheses. Now we don't have a graph, so we don't have to run our line across to see where we start and stop. When you have a list of ordered pairs, Your domain should also be a list. You should not have an interval because nothing about this is interval. These points are not connected. It is just a set of ordered pairs. So you have just these ordered pairs, these dots in your coordinate plane. So my domain is simply a list of all of my x values. Please don't forget that x comes first. So I'm going to have 1, -6, -9, +9, and -7. My range would simply be the list of all my y values, -9, -6, -8. And I'm not going to repeat -9. There's no sense in repeating a range or domain value. So 0 is my last range value. Okay. Same exact scenario. So all of my x's will be, all of the first part of the coordinate will be my domain. So I have -1, not going to repeat -1, 0, 2, and 1. My range will be the list of all of my y's, 5, 8, -5, -4, and again, I'm not going to repeat 8, and that is my range. Okay? So we added an extra element in these last few practice problems of whether or not something is a function. So remember, for it to be a function, it has to pass the vertical line test. And the very first time that we touch this discrete graph, I have 2 points on the same line, so that is going to be no. It is not a function. So again, like the relations that we saw in the last two problems, this is just a set of ordered pairs. There is no connection between these points, so there should be no interval in my domain. So I'm just going to list the x values. So I have x is -3, x is +1, x is +4, and x is +5. For my range, the same thing. I'm going to come from the bottom. So y is -4, y is 0, y is 1, and y is 5. Okay? So again, we want to do the same thing. Is this the function? I'm going to pass my vertical line across my graph, and as you can see, it does not touch the graph in more than one spot at the same time. So this is absolutely a function. So I'm going to take my line and help me with domain. So I'm going to come from the left. The first thing I touch on this graph is a line pointing to the left, and we know that if it's pointing in the direction of negative, that would be negative infinity because it's going to continue on forever and ever and ever. So then I'm going to take my line and I'm going to continue on until I get to the last part of the graph, which is another arrow pointing continuously to the right. And we indicate that in our interval notation with a positive infinity. So then we do range. So we're going to start from the bottom, work our way up. The first thing we touch is an arrow pointing forever and ever down. That arrow indicates the negative direction in y, so that's negative infinity, up to the highest point on the graph. There's no graph past this line. There is no arrow. The last thing I touch is when y is equal to 1. Nice continuous graph, no holes, no gaps, and we're going to indicate that with a closed bracket. Our last problem asks us again, is this a function? So we're going to do that vertical line test. And as you can see, we do not touch the graph in more than one spot at a time. So yes, this is a function. So then my domain, the first x value that I get to is -2 with an open dot, and I'm going to indicate that with a parenthesis. Up to, notice that the last thing we touch in the direction of x is an arrow pointing in the positive direction of x, which means our domain has to go to positive infinity. Okay? For range, we come up from the bottom. The first y value I touch is -2, and again, it is not included because it has an open dot. Then we're going to come on up until we get to that arrow. Now that arrow is pointing in the positive direction for y, which means that our graph is going to continue on in the positive direction for the range.